You will work those fields now!
Hold them steady!
This ain't right!
We won't break!
Some places do not forget what happened there, even when the houses are gone, even when the people who witnessed the horror are buried beneath generations of soil, even when the truth is scattered across burnt letters, broken memories, and whispered rumors. The land remembers. In Burke County, Georgia, there is a quiet stretch of water called Turkey Creek. It flows slowly through farmland that once belonged to a massive plantation called Willowbend. Today it looks ordinary, just another southern creek winding through cypress trees and tall grass. But for more than a century, people who lived nearby avoided one particular bend in the water. Old men refused to fish there. Women would walk nearly half a mile, farther just to wash clothes somewhere else. Children were warned never to play near that place, especially after sunset. Not because of ghosts, but because long ago, something far worse than ghosts happened there. Something that involved a grieving plantation mistress, a series of secret rituals performed before sunrise, and 3 enslaved men who walked into the cold water of Turkey Creek and never walked back out. And the most disturbing part, the woman responsible for it all knew exactly what she was doing. But before we uncover the truth behind the horrors of Willowbend, welcome to the channel. If you love dark historical mysteries, forgotten crimes, and the chilling stories history tried to bury, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a second to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story like this. And I'm curious, what city or country are you watching from right now? Leave it in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories travel across the world. Now settle in, because the story of Cordelia Rutledge and the rituals at Turkey Creek is one of the most disturbing mysteries to ever come out of the American South. And to understand how it began, we need to travel back to Georgia in the year 1838. In the spring of 1838, Willowbend Plantation was one of the most prosperous estates in Burke County. Spread across nearly 2,000 acres of fertile land, the plantation produced tobacco, cotton, and corn in quantities that made its owner one of the wealthiest men in the region. That man was Thomas Rutledge. Tall, well-spoken, and educated in Charleston, Thomas Rutledge had the kind of reputation that defined Southern aristocracy. He was known for his sharp business instincts and his ability to maintain order on a plantation that employed dozens of enslaved workers. But those who lived closest to the family knew something else. The real power at Willowbend didn't belong to Thomas. It belonged to his wife, Cordelia Rutledge. Cordelia had come from an old South Carolina family whose wealth had begun to fade. When she married Thomas, it was considered an ideal match, her social standing combined with his growing fortune. At first, their marriage appeared perfectly respectable, but over time, neighbors began noticing something unsettling about Cordelia. She was not like other plantation wives, where most women spent their days supervising household servants, hosting social gatherings, or tending gardens. Cordelia preferred solitude. She spent long hours locked inside her private study. She read constantly, medical texts, obscure scientific journals, and strange pamphlets sent by traveling physicians. Sometimes visitors reported hearing raised voices coming from behind the study door as Cordelia argued with her husband about matters no one else could understand. But whatever tensions existed, between them were kept carefully hidden from the outside world until February of 1838. That was the month Thomas Rutledge died. Officially, his death was ruled an accident. He had been thrown from his horse while inspecting the far edge of the plantation property. The fall had broken his neck. At least that was the story recorded by the local physician. And in the early days following the tragedy, no one had reason to doubt it. Cordelia appeared devastated. She wore black mourning dresses and rarely left her bedroom. Visitors who came to offer condolences described her as pale and fragile, a woman completely shattered by grief. But grief can do strange things to people, and in Cordelia Rutledge's case, grief did something much darker. Because only 3 days after her husband's burial, something unusual began happening at Turkey Creek. Every morning before sunrise, a small group of enslaved men were quietly taken from their quarters and escorted down a narrow path leading toward the creek. They were not brought there to fish, they were not brought there to work. Instead, they were ordered to stand waist-deep in the freezing water while Cordelia Rutledge conducted what she described as medical treatments. At first, the workers believed the mistress had simply lost her senses after the death of her husband, but the rituals continued day after day, week after week, and with each passing morning. The men who were forced to participate began to change. They became weaker, thinner, more confused. One of them, an experienced carpenter named Isaiah Drummond, told his nephew that the worst part was not the cold water or the strange procedures Cordelia forced them to endure. The worst part, he said, was the way his mind seemed to slip away from him, like pieces of himself were slowly being erased. He told his nephew something that would haunt that family for generations. "Dying ain't the worst thing," Isaiah whispered one evening. "The worst thing is feeling yourself disappear while you're still alive." At first, the overseers ignored the complaints. Enslaved workers were rarely taken seriously when they claimed mistreatment. But soon, other strange things began happening around the plantation. Cordelia started purchasing unusual chemicals and medical instruments from traveling merchants. She spent hours studying documents sent by a mysterious physician who signed his letters only as Dr. H, and she insisted that 3 particular men be brought to the creek every morning for what she described as experimental treatments. The explanation she gave was both bizarre and terrifying. Cordelia believed she was attempting to restore lost vitality. She had become convinced that the human body contained a kind of transferable life force, one that could be strengthened or renewed through carefully controlled procedures involving cold water, chemicals, and physical endurance. According to the physician advising her, these treatments could even reverse the damage caused by grief and illness. It was a theory with no scientific foundation. But to Cordelia, it made perfect sense, because she believed something else as well, something that had taken root in her mind after her husband's death. She believed Thomas Rutledge had been murdered, and she believed the people responsible were still living on the plantation. What started as grief slowly turned into obsession, and obsession soon became something far more dangerous. By early March of 1838, whispers began spreading among the enslaved community at Willowbend. The 3 men chosen for the treatments, Isaiah Drummond and 2 others, were growing weaker each day. Their hands trembled constantly. Their eyes looked hollow. Some nights they wandered their cabins unable to remember where they were. But the rituals continued. Each morning before dawn, Cordelia led them to the same bend in Turkey Creek, and each morning the water carried away another piece of them. No one dared stop her, because in the Old South, a plantation mistress had nearly absolute authority over the people she owned, even when that authority was used for something unspeakable. And the worst was still coming, because within just a few weeks, all 3 men would be dead, and the woman responsible would calmly record the entire process in her private journal, a journal that would not be discovered for decades. When it was finally read, historians would realize something horrifying. Cordelia Rutledge had not been acting blindly. She believed with absolute certainty that what she was doing was necessary. Necessary to uncover the truth. Necessary to restore what she believed had been stolen from her, and necessary to prove that the conspiracy she feared was real. Whether she was a victim driven mad by grief, or a calculating murderer hiding behind pseudoscience, would remain one of the most disturbing questions in the history of Burke County. But before the rituals at Turkey Creek turned deadly, before 3 lives were destroyed in the name of a delusion, before Cordelia Rutledge became one of the most infamous women the South would ever try to forget, there was a moment when everything might still have been stopped, a moment when someone could have stepped forward and said, "No more." But in a society built on silence, no one did, and the creek kept flowing, unchanged, cold, patient, waiting to witness what would happen next. The storm that had hovered over the plantation that night did not pass quickly. Instead, it lingered, heavy, low, and watchful, as if the sky itself had decided to remain and witness whatever was unfolding inside the old Virginia mansion. By 4 morning, the rain had stopped, but the clouds had not lifted. They hung like a grey ceiling over the tobacco fields, dulling the sunlight and muting the colours of the land. The plantation workers moved slowly that day, their footsteps softer than usual in the damp soil. Something had changed, not something visible, something felt. Inside the main house, the silence was even heavier. Thomas Whitaker had not slept. The plantation owner sat in his study, the same room where Jordan had stood the night before. The oil lamp had burned out hours earlier, leaving only the pale morning light creeping through the tall colonial windows. Papers were scattered across the table. Medical notes, letters, sketches of the human skull and spine. And in the center of it all sat the small, leather-bound journal that Thomas had written in through the night. His hands trembled as he turned another page. Every line he had written circled back to the same thing. Jordan. Not as a person, not as a man, but as a mystery. Thomas leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. He had spent years studying medicine in Boston before returning to Virginia to inherit the plantation. During those years, he had become fascinated with something few doctors dared discuss openly: the idea that certain people possessed unusual mental or physical abilities. Memory beyond normal limits, resistance to pain, strength that did not match their size. Stories circulated quietly among doctors and natural philosophers. Stories about rare individuals who seemed to operate differently from others. Thomas had dismissed most of those stories as exaggerations. Until now. Until Jordan. The man's calmness, the way he spoke, the way he held himself with a kind of quiet authority, even while standing in chains. And most of all, the moment Thomas had placed the cold metal instrument against Jordan's wrist the night before. Jordan's pulse had not changed, not even slightly. No fear, no anger, nothing. Thomas had never seen anything like it. He closed the journal slowly. Impossible, he whispered, but the word did not convince him. Behind him, the study door creaked open. Margaret Whitaker stood in the doorway. She had not slept either. Her pale face looked thinner in the morning light, and dark shadows rested beneath her eyes. Her once elegant silk gown had been replaced by a simple grey morning dress, though it still carried the quiet dignity of her upbringing. For several seconds, she simply watched her husband. "You're still thinking about him," she said softly. Thomas did not turn. "Yes." Margaret stepped further into the room. "You've been thinking about him for weeks," she continued. "Before he even came into this house." Thomas's jaw tightened. "He is unusual." Margaret crossed her arms. "Unusual," she repeated. There was bitterness in the word. "You mean he frightens you?" Thomas turned sharply in his chair. "I am not frightened." Margaret held his gaze. "No," she said quietly. "You're obsessed." The word hung in the air between them. Thomas looked back at the scattered papers on his desk. "You didn't see what I saw last night." Margaret's voice hardened. "I saw enough." She had watched from the doorway when Thomas questioned Jordan. She had seen the way the enslaved man stood calmly while her husband circled him like a scientist studying an animal. And she had seen something else. Something that disturbed her more than she wanted to admit. Jordan had not looked like a man being judged. He had looked like a man waiting for something or someone. Margaret walked toward the window and pulled the curtain. Aside, the field stretched endlessly beyond the house. Workers were already moving among the rows of tobacco plants, their figures small against the wide grey sky. She spoke without turning. "You're forgetting something." Thomas frowned. "What?" Margaret's voice dropped lower. "People like him have stories." Thomas said nothing. She continued. "The Workers talk, Thomas. You may not listen to them, but I do. He leaned forward slightly. And what stories are they telling? Margaret hesitated. For the first time that morning, uncertainty flickered across her face. They say he was sold 3 times in 2 years. Thomas raised an eyebrow. That's not unusual. Margaret shook her head slowly. No. Her fingers tightened against the curtain. What's unusual is why. Thomas waited. Margaret turned toward him. They say every plantation he was taken to. Something happened. Thomas gave a tired laugh. Let me guess. She did not smile. Fires. The word seemed to darken the room. Not accidents, Margaret continued. Entire barns burned down. One owner lost half his tobacco crop in a single night. Thomas leaned back in his chair. And somehow this man caused all of it? Margaret's voice was almost a whisper. The workers say he never touched a flame. Thomas stared at her. Then how? Margaret held his gaze. They say trouble follows him. A long silence filled the study. Outside, thunder rolled faintly. Across the distant hills, Thomas finally spoke again. Superstition. But his voice lacked certainty. Margaret walked closer to the desk. There's more. Thomas looked up. They say he doesn't fear masters, she said, or punishment, or death. Thomas exhaled slowly. That's impossible. Margaret's eyes hardened. Then why didn't his pulse change when you threatened him? The question struck like a hammer. Thomas froze. How do you know about that? Margaret gave a thin smile. You forget how thin these walls are. Thomas looked back down at his notes. His mind was racing again. If the stories were true, if Jordan had moved from plantation to plantation, leaving destruction behind, then perhaps it wasn't coincidence. Perhaps it was something else, something hidden, something powerful. The thought made his pulse quicken. Margaret saw the excitement flicker across his face, and it frightened her. You're not listening to me, she said. Thomas looked up. You're studying him like a specimen. Margaret stepped closer. But he's not a specimen, she lowered her voice. He's a man. Thomas's expression hardened. A man who may hold answers. Margaret stared at him. Answers to what? Thomas did not hesitate. To everything we don't understand. Margaret shook her head slowly. Or to something you shouldn't try to control. The thunder outside grew louder, and for the first time since the conversation began, Whitaker wondered if his wife might be right. Meanwhile, across the plantation grounds, Jordan was already working in the fields. The overseer watched him carefully. Word had spread quickly among the workers about what had happened inside the mansion the night before. They had seen Jordan taken into the house, and they had seen him walk out again, unharmed. That alone was unusual. But there was something else. Something about the way Jordan moved now. He walked slowly through the rows of tobacco plants, carrying bundles with steady strength. His expression remained calm, his eyes scanning the horizon with quiet patience. Several workers avoided looking at him, others watched with curiosity. One elderly man finally stepped closer. Jordan, he whispered. Jordan kept working. Yes. The old man lowered his voice even more. You should be careful. Jordan glanced at him. About what? The old man swallowed. The master is watching you. Jordan's face remained unreadable. I know, the man hesitated. You've seen men like him before. Jordan nodded slowly. Yes. What do they want? Jordan paused for a moment. Then he said quietly, to understand what they cannot control. The old man looked uneasy. And if they can't? Jordan returned to his work. Then they try to destroy it. A distant crack of thunder echoed across the plantation. The sky darkened again. And somewhere inside the mansion, Thomas Whitaker opened his journal and wrote a single sentence across a fresh page. Subject displays unnatural composure. Further observation required. But outside, Jordan lifted his eyes briefly toward the house, and for the first time since arriving on the plantation, a faint, knowing smile touched his face, because he understood something Thomas did not. The plantation owner believed he was studying Jordan, but the truth was far more dangerous. Jordan was studying him, and the storm gathering over the Whitaker plantation had only just begun. By the third day after the storm, the Whitaker plantation had begun to feel different, not in a way that could be easily explained. Nothing obvious had changed. The fields were still full of workers bending over rows of tobacco plants. The mansion still stood tall and silent above the land. The overseers still walked their usual paths with watchful eyes, but beneath the routine, something quiet had shifted, and everyone could feel it. It started with the animals. Before dawn one morning, the horses in the plantation stable began stomping their hooves and snorting nervously. The stable boy, a young teenager named Caleb, rushed inside with a lantern, expecting to find a snake or some kind of wild animal. Instead, the horses stood pressed tightly together against the far wall. Their eyes were wide, their muscles tense. Caleb slowly raised the lantern, scanning the stable. Nothing. No predator. No broken boards. No movement at all. Yet the horses refused to calm down. For the rest of the morning they remained restless, jerking their heads toward the distant plantation house as if they sensed something. The humans could not. Caleb later whispered about it to the other workers in the field, and soon the murmurs began spreading again. Something's wrong here. Ever since he came. Jordan heard the whispers, but he said nothing. He continued working with the same calm rhythm he always had, his movements steady and precise. If the rumors bothered him, he did not show it. But there were moments, small, brief moments, when his eyes drifted toward the plantation mansion on the hill, as if he were listening. Inside the house, Thomas Whitaker had begun his observations. His study now looked less like the office of a plantation owner and more like a laboratory. Books lay open across the desk, medical instruments rested beside glass bottles, and metal tools. Several pages of notes were pinned to the wall beside a large sketch of the human nervous system. Thomas had not been this focused in years. Each day he found small reasons to bring Jordan into the house. Sometimes it was for a simple task, carrying wood, repairing a chair, moving crates from the cellar. But every time Jordan entered the room, Thomas watched carefully, the man's posture, his breathing, the movement of his hands. Most of all, his eyes. Jordan never avoided Thomas's gaze, but he never challenged it either. He simply looked at him the way someone might look at a passing stranger, and that, more than anything, unsettled Thomas. On the afternoon of the third day, Jordan stood inside the study again. This time, Thomas held a small brass instrument in his hand. "Extend your arm," Thomas said calmly. Jordan did. The plantation owner wrapped a thin leather band around Jordan's wrist and attached the brass device. Margaret Whitaker stood quietly in the corner of the room. She had tried to avoid these sessions at first, but something in her would not allow her to stay away. Thomas adjusted the device carefully. "This measures pulse pressure," he explained, though Jordan had not asked. Jordan looked down at the instrument. "Why?" Thomas hesitated. "Because you are unusual." Jordan raised his eyes again. "How so?" Thomas leaned forward. "Your pulse remains steady under stress. Your breathing does not change when threatened. And your body shows almost no reaction to pain." Jordan listened quietly. "And this concerns you?" Thomas gave a short nod. "It fascinates me." Margaret's voice cut softly through the room. "It frightens him." Thomas shot her an irritated look. Jordan's expression did not change. Thomas continued adjusting the instrument. "Think of this as a study," he said. Jordan tilted his head slightly. "Of what?" Thomas paused. Then he said the words that had been forming in his mind for days. "Of what makes you different." For the first time since entering the room, Jordan smiled, but it was not a mocking smile. It was something quieter, something that almost looked like recognition. "You believe?" "I'm different," Jordan said softly. Thomas met his gaze. "I know you are." Jordan glanced briefly toward Margaret. She was watching him closely now, not with fear, with curiosity. Jordan returned his attention to Thomas. "And what happens if you discover why?" Thomas answered without hesitation. "Then I will understand, something no one else does." Jordan's smile faded slightly. "And what will you do with that understanding?" Thomas leaned back in his chair. "That depends on what I find." The room fell silent. Then suddenly, a loud crash echoed somewhere in the house. Margaret jumped. Thomas stood up sharply. The sound had come from downstairs. The three of them hurried. Into the hallway, a servant woman stood near the staircase, staring toward the dining room. "What happened?" Margaret asked. The woman pointed. "The cabinet, ma'am." They entered the dining room. A large wooden cabinet that had stood against the wall for years now lay tipped over on its side. Dishes were scattered across the floor. Shattered glass glittered. In the dim afternoon light, Thomas frowned. "That cabinet weighs hundreds of pounds." The servant shook her head nervously. "No one touched it, sir." Margaret glanced toward Jordan. He stood near the doorway, watching quietly. Thomas walked closer to the fallen cabinet, examining it. The floor beneath it showed no signs of being pushed, no scrape marks, no broken supports. It had simply fallen, as if something had pulled it forward. Thomas stood slowly. His eyes moved back toward Jordan. The enslaved man had not moved. His pulse instrument still rested on his wrist, and the small needle on the device had not shifted even slightly. Thomas felt a strange chill crawl up his spine. He turned toward Margaret. "Have the servants clean this up." Then he looked at Jordan. "You may return to the fields." Jordan nodded once. As he turned to leave, Margaret noticed something. The brass instrument still attached to his wrist had recorded every second of the incident. Thomas grabbed the device. Quickly, once Jordan stepped outside, he studied the reading. The needle had remained perfectly steady, even during the loud crash, even when the others had jumped in surprise. Jordan's body had not reacted at all. Margaret watched her husband carefully. "What does it mean?" she asked. Thomas slowly removed the instrument. His voice was almost a whisper. "It means he knew." Margaret frowned. "Knew what?" Thomas looked toward the door Jordan had just walked through. He knew it was going to happen. That evening, the storm returned. Dark clouds rolled across the Virginia sky again, heavier than before. Workers hurried back toward the cabins as thunder rumbled in the distance. Lightning flashed across the tobacco fields. Inside the small worker cabins, whispers moved from one voice to another. "Did you hear about the cabinet? They say it fell on its own. They say he was inside the house when it happened." One older woman shook her head slowly. "I've seen men like him before." The others leaned closer. "Where?" "Down in Carolina." "What happened?" The woman stared into the fire. The plantation burned. A nervous silence filled the cabin. "Did he do it?" someone whispered. The woman shook her head. "No one ever saw him near the flames." "Then how?" Her voice dropped lower. "Trouble finds certain people." The workers glanced toward the door, where rain now pounded against the wooden walls. "And sometimes," the woman continued quietly, "those people bring change with them." Across the plantation, Jordan sat alone outside his cabin. Rain soaked the ground around him, but he did not move. He simply watched the lightning flash across the distant mansion. Inside the house, Thomas Whitaker stood at the window of his study. He was watching the same storm, the same flashes of light across the fields. His mind was racing. The cabinet, the steady pulse, the stories Margaret had told him. He opened his journal again. With slow, careful handwriting, he wrote, "Subject may possess heightened awareness of surrounding events, possibly anticipatory." He paused, then added another line, "Further testing required." Outside, lightning lit the plantation again, and far below the mansion, Jordan finally stood. He looked toward the house one more time, not with anger, not with fear, but with quiet patience. Because he understood something, Thomas Whitaker still did not. The plantation owner believed the strange events had just begun. But Jordan knew the truth. This was only the first warning, and before the storm was over, the Whitaker plantation would never be the same again. The first fire began quietly. So quietly, in fact, that no one noticed it at first. It was just after midnight when a faint smell of smoke drifted through the lower halls of the Whitaker mansion. One of the house servants, a young girl carrying a lantern to the kitchen, paused when she noticed the scent. At first she thought it was only the storm outside. Lightning had been striking the surrounding woods all evening. Thunder rolled endlessly across the Virginia hills, shaking the windows of the old plantation house. But the smell grew stronger. She followed it slowly down the back corridor. When she reached the cellar door, she stopped. Thin grey smoke was slipping through the crack beneath it. Her lantern trembled in her hands. Within seconds, the entire house was awake. Servants rushed down the stairwell carrying buckets, while Thomas Whitaker burst from his study, coat half on, shouting orders. "Water! Quickly! The well!" Margaret Whitaker stood at the top of the staircase, gripping the railing as chaos filled the house. By the time the cellar door was thrown open, thick smoke poured into the hallway. Inside, a small stack of wooden crates near. The far wall had caught fire. The flames themselves were not large yet, but something about the way they burned made several of the servants hesitate. The fire did not spread the way ordinary fires did. Instead of climbing upward, it moved slowly. Along the ground, as if following something unseen, Thomas stepped forward, grabbing a bucket. "Throw water on it." The first splash hit the flames with a loud hiss. The fire shrank. For a moment it looked like it might die out completely. Then suddenly, the flames surged again, stronger than before. The servants backed away in alarm. Another bucket of water came. Down! This time the fire only crackled and shifted, spreading toward a second crate nearby. Thomas stared at it, confused. "This makes no sense," he muttered. Margaret appeared behind him at the cellar doorway. Her voice was quiet. "Thomas." He didn't turn. "What?" Her eyes moved slowly across the cellar floor. "Where did those crates come from?" Thomas looked again. The crates were unfamiliar. They weren't the usual food or supply boxes stored in the cellar. These were older, the wood darker, almost blackened with age. He stepped closer. One of the lids had partially burned away. Inside were glass bottles. Several had already shattered from the heat. The floor around them was wet with some kind of dark liquid. Thomas felt a strange chill. "These shouldn't be here," he said slowly. "Then where did they come from?" Margaret asked. Before he could answer, one of the servants shouted, "Sir, it's spreading." The liquid leaking from the broken bottles had begun feeding the flames. The fire crawled across the floor toward the far wall like a living thing. Thomas swore under his breath, "More water." For nearly an hour they fought the fire. Bucket after bucket, sweat and smoke filled the cellar until breathing became difficult. Finally, the flames began to weaken. The last embers died with a faint crackle. Exhausted servants leaned against the walls. Thomas wiped soot from his face. Margaret looked around the blackened cellar floor. The broken crates lay scattered among puddles of strange chemical residue. She turned to her husband. "Thomas, why were medical chemicals stored under this house?" Thomas frowned. "I never stored anything like this." The silence that followed was heavy. Then one of the older servants spoke quietly. "Sir," Thomas looked at him. "What?" The man hesitated before answering. "Jordan was in the fields near the cellar entrance tonight." Margaret's head turned sharply. "When?" "Just before the storm got bad." Thomas felt a flicker of irritation. "That proves nothing." But the servant continued. He was standing there, watching the house. Margaret said nothing, but the thought had already begun forming in her mind. The next morning, the plantation buzzed with rumors. By sunrise, nearly every worker had heard about the fire in the cellar, and once again, Jordan's name drifted through. The whispers. He was near the house. They say he knew something was wrong before the smoke even started. They say he walked away right before the alarm was raised. None of the stories were certain, but each version made the mystery grow. Jordan himself worked quietly in the tobacco rows that morning. His hands moved with the same calm precision as always. The overseer watched him carefully from horseback. Finally, he rode closer. "You been near the house last night?" "House last." Jordan didn't stop working. "Yes." "What were you doing there?" Jordan straightened slowly, looking at the storm. The overseer narrowed his eyes. "You see any fire?" "No." "Any smoke?" Jordan shook his head. The overseer studied him for another moment, then rode away. Jordan returned to his work. But several of the other workers had been listening, and the whispers only grew stronger. Inside the plantation mansion, Thomas Whitaker sat alone in his study. The events of the night had unsettled him deeply. He had spent the entire morning examining the burned crates from the cellar. Now their contents lay spread across his desk: broken bottles, metal tools, fragments of old medical equipment. He picked up one of the surviving labels. The faded handwriting made his stomach tighten. It was not his writing, nor was it any servant's. But the name of the substance was clear: chloroform. Thomas leaned back in his chair. Why? Would someone hide chloroform beneath the cellar? More importantly, why had it caught fire? His thoughts returned again to Jordan, the steady pulse, the falling cabinet, the fire starting shortly after Jordan had been seen near the house. Thomas didn't like the direction his mind was going, but the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Margaret stepped inside. "You're still studying those things?" Thomas nodded. "Someone hid chemicals beneath our house." Margaret walked closer to the desk. "And you believe Jordan is responsible?" Thomas hesitated. "I believe he knows something." Margaret studied her husband carefully. "You're beginning to sound afraid." Thomas gave a quiet laugh. "I'm not afraid of a field worker." But even as he said it, something in his voice lacked certainty. Margaret noticed. "Then why do you keep watching him?" Thomas looked down at the notes scattered across his desk. "Because everything that has happened since he arrived seems connected to him." Margaret folded her arms. "And what if the connection is not what you think?" Thomas frowned. "What do you mean?" Margaret's voice lowered. "What if he's not causing these things?" Thomas stared at her. "Then what is he doing?" Margaret answered slowly. "What if he's waiting for them?" The words hung in the air. For the first time since this strange series of events had begun, Thomas felt something he had not expected. Uncertainty. That evening, Margaret did something she had never done before. She walked alone toward the worker cabins. The sun had already begun to set, painting the tobacco fields in deep orange shadows. Several workers glanced up as she approached. A plantation mistress rarely visited this part of the property. Margaret moved slowly through the cabins until she reached the last one. Jordan sat outside repairing a broken tool. He looked up when her shadow crossed the ground. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Margaret asked quietly, "Did you start the fire?" Jordan shook his head. "No." "Do you know who did?" "No." Margaret studied him carefully. "You knew something was wrong before it happened." Jordan continued working. "The storm was strong." "That's not what I mean." Jordan finally looked up. Their eyes met. Margaret felt the same strange sensation Thomas had described. Not fear, something else, something deeper. "You believe I caused these things?" Jordan said calmly. Margaret didn't answer immediately. "Did you?" Jordan's voice remained steady. "No." "Then why does it seem like every strange event happens around you?" Jordan thought for a moment. Then he asked a question of his own. "Do you believe storms cause lightning?" Margaret frowned slightly. "What? Or does lightning simply happen when the conditions are right?" Margaret felt a shiver run through her. "What are you saying?" Jordan placed the repaired tool beside him. "Some places hold more tension than others." His gaze drifted toward the distant mansion. "Some houses." Margaret followed his eyes. "What kind of tension?" Jordan's voice grew quieter. "The kind that builds for years. The kind that waits Margaret looked back at him. And then? Jordan met her gaze again. Then one small spark is enough. A sudden gust of wind rustled through the trees. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself. You sound like you're warning me. Jordan did not deny it. Maybe I am. Margaret hesitated. About what? Jordan stood slowly. The house. Margaret's heart skipped slightly. What about it? Jordan's voice dropped almost to a whisper. Not everything buried beneath it is meant to stay hidden. Margaret felt the chill again. Those crates in the cellar. Jordan nodded. Once. They're only the beginning. Margaret stared at him. What does that mean? But Jordan had already turned away. His final words followed her as she walked back toward the mansion. Some fires, he said quietly, have been waiting a long time to burn. That night, Margaret could not sleep. The storm had passed. But the air around the Whitaker plantation felt heavier than ever. Somewhere deep in the house, the old wooden beams creaked softly. Margaret stared at the ceiling, listening. And for the first time since she had married Thomas Whitaker, she wondered what secrets the plantation itself might be hiding, because Jordan's warning echoed again in her mind. Not everything buried beneath the house is meant to stay hidden. And somewhere, beneath the mansion's foundation, something was already beginning to wake. Some places hold memories longer than people do. Long after the Whitaker plantation disappeared from the land, long after the house collapsed into dust and weeds, long after the people who lived and died there were buried and forgotten. The creek kept flowing. Turkey Creek still moved through Burke County the way it always had, cold, steady, and quiet. But the bend where the rituals had once taken place never felt like the rest of the water. Even decades later, the air around that stretch of bank carried a strange stillness. Birds rarely landed in the cypress branches there. Fishermen who cast their lines upstream avoided drifting too close. And the people who lived nearby passed the place quickly, often without even realizing why. Something about that piece of land never fully let go of what had happened there. Because what happened at Willowbend did not truly end with Cordelia Rutledge. It only faded into silence. The plantation itself survived for a while after Cordelia was taken away. Her sister-in-law, Catherine Vance, took control of Willowbend soon after the trial. She arrived quietly in the summer of 1839 with a lawyer and 2 wagons full of documents. Unlike Cordelia, Catherine was practical. Cold, but practical. She did not care about the madness that had taken root at the plantation. She cared about restoring order. The first thing she did was dismiss several overseers who had served under Cordelia. The second thing she did was sell most of the enslaved workers connected to the case. Among them were the children Cordelia's husband had fathered with enslaved women, children whose existence had fueled Cordelia's obsession and rage. Except for the 3 boys she had murdered at the creek, the rest were sold south, or West, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. Their names were removed from plantation ledgers. Their connection to the Rutledge family erased as if it had never existed. By the end of that year, the Willowbend records looked neat again, clean, respectable. But Catherine Vance knew better. She knew the plantation itself had been poisoned. And some things could not be fixed with paperwork. Cordelia Rutledge spent the rest of her life inside the Milledgeville State Asylum. At first, the doctors believed she would remain violent and unstable. But they quickly discovered something strange. Cordelia was not insane in the way they expected. She did not scream. She did not hallucinate. She did not wander the halls babbling nonsense like many of the other patients. Instead, she behaved with unsettling calm. She read books. She wrote long journal entries. She spoke politely with staff members. Occasionally, she even assisted nurses with basic tasks. But when doctors asked about the murders, she never denied them, and she never expressed remorse. One physician wrote in his notes in 1844, "Mrs. Rutledge demonstrates clear awareness of her crimes. She understands the moral and legal implications fully, yet she remains convinced that what she did was necessary. Another doctor attempted to challenge her reasoning. "Even if your husband betrayed you," he said once, "how could killing innocent men help you?" Cordelia answered quietly. "Because something had already been taken from me." The doctor frowned. "What do you mean?" Cordelia looked toward the window. "My life." Then she returned to writing. Back in Burke County, Willowbend continued to operate, but it never prospered the way it once had. Something about the land seemed wrong. Crops failed more often than expected. Workers ran away more frequently. 2 overseers left suddenly after claiming they heard voices near Turkey Creek at night. By the early 1860s, the plantation had changed owners twice. Then came the Civil War, and in 1864, General William Tecumseh Sherman's army marched through Georgia. When Union troops reached Burke County, they burned several plantations suspected of supporting Confederate forces. Willowbend was among them. The main house that had once stood proud above the fields was set on fire and left to collapse. The time the war ended, nothing remained but scorched foundations and scattered chimneys. The plantation was eventually divided into smaller farms. New families moved onto the land, and the name Willowbend slowly disappeared from local maps. But the creek remained, and the stories remained. Freed men living near the area during the 1870s refused to wash clothes or fish in one particular bend of the water. They said the place was cursed. They said the water had tasted blood. Older residents whispered about the plantation mistress who believed she could steal life from enslaved men. Some people claimed the creek sometimes carried a strange smell on cold mornings. Others said the cypress trees along that stretch of water never seemed to grow as thick as the rest. Whether those stories were true or not hardly mattered. By the 1890s, even white farmers avoided building too close to the creek. No one could fully explain why, but something about that land never felt peaceful. One of the strangest discoveries happened in 1891. A farmer plowing what had once been part of Willowbend's eastern field struck something buried underground. When he dug it up, he found a small wooden box. Inside were glass bottles, old medical instruments, and several bundles of paper tied with string. The handwriting on the pages had faded badly, but some words could still be seen. Treatment, vitality, transfer. The farmer had never heard the full story of Cordelia Rutledge, but something about those papers made him uneasy. He buried the box again that same afternoon, and he never told anyone except his wife. Years later, when he died in 1903, his wife burned his diary. When neighbors asked why, she simply said, "Some things are better left in the ground." The last surviving piece of Cordelia's story surfaced in 1899. A Charleston attorney named Robert Dunor was settling the estate of an elderly widow named Catherine Vance, the same woman who had taken control of Willowbend after the murders. While sorting through her belongings, Dunor opened a locked trunk. Inside, he found a collection of old documents, letters, financial records, and several pages written in Cordelia Rutledge's handwriting. One letter stood out immediately. It had been written from the asylum in 1846. Dunor read it once. Then, he sat silently for nearly an hour. Years later, he described the letter to a colleague. His voice reportedly shook when he spoke about it. "She understood everything," Dunor said. "She knew she had been deceived by that physician. She knew the rituals were madness. She knew the men she killed were innocent." His colleague asked the obvious question. "Then why did she do it?" Dunor answered quietly. "That is the disturbing part." He paused before continuing. "Even knowing all of this, she wrote that she still believed she had no other choice." The colleague stared at him. "What did you do with the letter?" Dunor replied simply, "I burned it." He destroyed most of the documents from Catherine Vance's trunk, but he kept one page. A single journal entry written by Cordelia on March 10, 1838, just days after the rituals at Turkey Creek began. The entry read, "I have begun the treatments Dr. H. prescribed. The 3 subjects responded as expected to the initial procedures. At first, I felt nothing. But today, I felt something. Perhaps it was the cold water. Perhaps it was only the relief of taking action after so many years of helplessness. Or perhaps the treatment works. I cannot yet be certain. But I know this. I will continue. I have gone too far to stop now. That single page remained in the Dunor family archives until 1947. When Dunor's grandson donated it to the Georgia Historical Society, historians quietly placed it into a restricted collection. It was catalogued, but never displayed. The story was considered too disturbing and too incomplete. The final living witness to the Willowbend tragedy was a woman named Sarah Drummond. She had been born in 1835, and she was the niece of Isaiah Drummond, the carpenter who had been murdered at Turkey Creek. Sarah lived an extraordinarily long life. She died in 1941 at the age of 106. In her final years, she sometimes spoke about her uncle. She described him as a gentle man, smart, talented with wood and tools. But what haunted her most was something Isaiah had told her shortly before his death. According to Sarah, he once said, "Dying isn't the worst thing they can do to you. The worst thing is forgetting who you are while you're still alive." Sarah never fully understood what he meant as a child, but she wept whenever she repeated those words decades later, because some pain echoes across generations. Today, nothing remains of Willowbend Plantation, no house, no fields, no sign that hundreds of lives were once controlled there. Only the creek still flows, clear, cold, quiet. The bend where Cordelia performed her rituals is completely unmarked. If you walked past it today, you would see nothing unusual, just water moving between the trees. But the land remembers. Water remembers. And scattered descendants across Georgia still carry fragments of the story. Fragments that refuse to disappear, like stains that time can never fully wash away. And that leaves us with a question that history never fully answered. Was Cordelia Rutledge simply a monster? A woman who allowed jealousy and rage to transform her into a murderer? Or was she also a victim? A grieving wife manipulated by a fraudulent doctor? A woman trapped in a brutal society built on slavery, power, and silence? Maybe the truth lies somewhere in between. But one thing is certain. The tragedy at Turkey Creek shows how easily grief, betrayal, and desperation can turn ordinary people into something unrecognizable, and how systems built on oppression can allow terrible crimes to happen without consequence. Thanks for watching.